And I too, like Ken, would like to acknowledge the tremendous work of the people who have done so much work today. Obviously, Nurit has shown tremendous courage, but she has to go back, you know, and face her own press and those people who have conducted this war. So I'd like to pay my deepest respect to her and to her children. Her 16-year-old just now will probably refuse to do military service. Isn't it interesting, the people who oppose violence are the ones who are thrown in prison? I think that's very interesting. Can I just tell you one tiny little story? Many years ago, when I was actually a very young, naive lawyer, I worked in Nicaragua in the 80s. And I remember a very important day, and that was in 1986, when the World Court found the United States government guilty of 10 different violations of international law. Also remember that it was backed almost unanimously by the General Assembly. Of course, the United States and Israel and a few other dependent states refused to do it. And I remember that day very well. I remember there was going to be a great feeling of enthusiasm by many of my Nicaraguan friends. And they were also called for reparation for the ports that were destroyed. But it was a recognition of the systematic violence against the civilian population. So there was a deep sense of satisfaction. And what happened with that? Absolutely nothing. Worse than nothing. In fact, on the day that the World Court actually made its decision, the US Congress awarded $187 million to the Contra, who every human rights organisation said were guilty of violations against international law. Now also remember the disillusion, the melancholy, the sadness and the fury of Nicaraguans on the street. There was a sense of, you know, what is the point of this? What is the point of international law? What is the point of all these jurists? And it always echoed with me that feeling of fury and anger. So when I listened to Leila today saying there's been over 300 resolutions of the United Nations, it's beyond belief or beyond my imagination to imagine what the people in Gaza are feeling when they're told to respect international law and human rights. The hypocrisy is just quite unbelievable. Now listen to all my speakers there today as well. For no apparent reason I couldn't get this. Have you ever been to London and on the Underground? And everybody says, mind the gap. Mind the gap. It just kept echoing in my head as I listened to these speakers today. The mind the gap. Well, we mind the gap between international law and its implementation. And if we don't, in that space, in that gap, festers impunity. And what does impunity mean? It just means that those responsible will never face the consequences of their action. In other words, what we're talking about is international state terrorism. And if we have international state terrorism, what does that do to the freelancers who are much less efficient, just the so-called bad terrorists? I think there is tremendous hypocrisy in this debate, and I think this tribunal, I hope, will help us mind that tremendous gap. And it has no power in terms of implementation, but what I think we can do once it comes to conclusions, we can ask President Obama and say, if this country is guilty of so many violations of international law, why are your taxpayers paying $3 billion every single year to uphold that? Because they cannot do it without it. And unfortunately, the European Union seems to be equally as supine. So I really hope this tribunal will do tremendous work. I'm sure it will, and it shows against the importance of civil society, of ordinary citizens who are furious at these systematic abuse of human rights. Thank you very much. What we have is an international framework of human rights law and the United Nations and the legislation that has been set up. And what is absolutely becoming clearer and clearer now, there is a huge gap between what the international law says and what powerful nations do. You know, so today we were talking about that gap between what the law says and implementation by powerful states. And it reminds me of the London Underground, mind the gap. If there's a danger between the train and the platform. And what we have now is a massive chasm opening up between the law and its implementation. And the great danger is, if that gap continues to grow, inside that gap festers impunity. And what does impunity mean? Impunity means that powerful states do what they want and don't give a damn about the consequences. And what does that mean? It means state terrorism. Now, I saw that when I was in Nicaragua in the 1980s. The World Court found the United States guilty of 10 different violations of international law. And what happened? Absolutely nothing. In fact, on the same day that that decision was made, they gave $187 million to the Contra. So in other words, what they were doing was undermining international law. Now when it comes to look at the situation in Palestine, it is even worse. And all we have to do is look at that very important landmark decision in 2004, when they said they must take the wall is illegal, and absolutely nothing happens. Now, if international law continues to be disrespected, what we will have is the law of the jungle. We will have international state terrorism, which in its turn, I think, encourages freelance terrorism. And so what we have is total and absolute anarchy. So I think to help bridge that gap, we must look for support from civilian organisations. And I think this tribunal will try to do that. It will try and examine what the conclusions that law has come to and try and disentangle why these decisions have not been implemented, and that's very, very important. And for example, now we can look at, for example, it would be a very interesting question now, once the conclusions are reached and we see that all these laws have been disobeyed, it might be a very interesting question to ask the United States population why they're supporting the state of Israel with $3 billion a year. How can President Obama justify handing over such money when the state to which he gives that money is in total breach of international law? So I think it will help bridge that gap, and I think that's very, very important and could be very practical.